If I asked you to describe Gus Fring, a whole host of words would spring to mind: calm, polite, efficient, professional. Meticulous, patient, terrifying. There's the courteous fast food manager wiping tables. There's the quiet philanthropist shaking hands with cops and teachers. And then there's the man who walks into a nursing home to face down a cartel legend without even raising his voice. But if I had to sum up the essence of this character in one word, it would be engineered. Gus isn't just smart. He's designed. Every inch of his life is built for control and advantage. His public image, his businesses, his routines, even the way he stands with his hands behind his back feels calculated. He doesn't win because he's the smartest man in the room. He wins because he designs the room. The Los Pollos Hermanos chain, the industrial laundry, the charity foundation, none of these are just covers. They're interlocking systems that generate money, logistics, and political protection all at once. On the surface, he looks respectable. He sponsors dia fun runs. He donates chicken to law enforcement. He smiles for photos with the very people hunting the cartel. Yet behind that facade is a ruthless mastermind who orders executions with the same tone he uses to offer refills. That's the moral illusion at the core of Gus Fring. His politeness isn't a virtue. It's a weapon. He uses courtesy the way other villains use guns. It disarms. It lowers suspicion. It buys him just enough time for the trap to close. Right from the beginning, the writers established that contrast. When Hank and the Dia tour Los Pollos Hermanos, Gus plays the gracious host. But you know he's silently mapping every angle, every badge, every weakness. While they're enjoying lunch, he's conducting surveillance. This is a man who hoards information the way Walter hoards cash. He keeps secrets in plain sight, and the audience watches as everyone around him underestimates him because he never needs to shout to be heard. That created a huge challenge for the writers. How do you make a soft-spoken manager in a yellow shirt feel more dangerous than screaming cartel bosses? The answer is obvious. Intimidation won't work. Gus almost never loses his temper. He doesn't improvise wildly. He hates chaos. So instead, they make him terrifying through strategy, through long-term planning, through the feeling that every scene with him is already 3 moves into a game you didn't know you were playing. So let's examine the real question at the heart of his character. How does a man who never raises his voice, who walks instead of runs, and who seems almost allergic to impulsive violence, still manage to outplay cartel warlords, DIA agents, and Walter White for years? Is it just patience? Is it pure discipline? Or is there a deeper architecture behind his foresight? In the next section, we're going to start pulling apart the systems that kept Gus Fring one step ahead, right up until the moment they didn't. Gus Fring doesn't win because he's the smartest man in the room. He wins because he designs the room, controls the exits, and decides who even gets invited in the first place. While Walt is improvising, flailing, pulling off brilliant but desperate plays, Gus is quietly arranging the furniture of the entire world they're playing in. If I asked you to describe Gus, you'd probably reach for words like patient, disciplined, meticulous, ruthless. But if I had to sum up the essence of this character in one word, it would be architectural. Gus isn't just manipulative in a moment-to-moment way. His real power is strategic architecture. He builds routines, covers, and redundancies so that by the time anyone else moves, their options are already constrained by a system he designed years earlier. So let's examine what that actually means. When you see Gus at Los Pollos Hermanos handing out free refills and cleaning tables, the scene looks boring, almost aggressively normal. But that fast food chain is a logistics network, a recruiting funnel, and a public relations shield in one. The industrial laundry is a super lab and a dead-end maze. His charity foundation buys goodwill with law enforcement and the community. Every respectable space he builds is also a controlled environment where he owns the cameras, the schedules, and the cover story before any investigation even starts. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Gus's core instinct is to reduce uncertainty through systems. He doesn't just have a driver. He has Mike and Tyrus, personally vetted, trained to follow procedure over ego. He doesn't just have one supply line. He runs cartel product and his own super lab in parallel, so that no single partner, not even the cartel, can strangle him. Information is always asymmetric. Gus knows more about you than you know about him, and even when he walks into danger, like the cartel poisoning, He's already rehearsed the worst-case scenario and built his body and his mind to survive it. That's the scope of what we're going to track. From his early dealings with the cartel and Hector Salamanca, through the slow burn revenge that takes years to mature, all the way to his final confrontation with Walter White. We're going to follow how his systems create information asymmetry and safety. How does he keep secrets without ever seeming secretive? How does he maintain control while barely raising his voice? To do that, we'll break his one-step-ahead advantage into domains. The first is his public life. The chicken man, the charity donor, the guy every cop trusts. Then his business operations, the lab, the roots, the routines that make his empire feel inevitable. Then his information networks, his emotional control, and finally the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation, long-term revenge as a structural project, not an outburst. And we're going to start with the piece that looks the dullest on the surface. The chicken. The smiling manager. The charity checks, because the most boring-looking part of Gus's life is actually his deadliest weapon, and once you see how that works, every polite scene with him will feel like a trap you just hadn't noticed yet. So if I asked you to point to the thing that makes Gus Fring dangerous, you'd probably go to the super lab, the cartel meetings, the box cutter. But the real horror is that none of that works without the most boring thing in the world. A fast food franchise and a polite manager who remembers your order. That's the first domain of his power. The chicken man. The mask. If we start with his public life, Los Pollos Hermanos, the charity foundation, the donations to the Dia picnic, you're looking at the outer shell that makes his inner empire possible. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Gus is not hiding in a basement. He's hiding in plain sight, wrapped in fluorescent lighting and family-friendly branding. Every have a nice day is structural camouflage. The cartel has deserts and safe houses. Gus has birthday parties and combo meals. So let's examine the actual tool he's using here. Respectability as armor. Gus understands that in America, a clean, generous, tax-paying businessman is practically sacred. You don't raid the guy who funds scholarships. You put him on a plaque. Community goodwill and perfect optics become a shield more bulletproof than any vest, because they don't just deflect suspicion, they make suspicion itself look irrational. If a cop questions Gus too hard, it reflects worse on the cop than on Gus. And this isn't alien behavior. You do a smaller version of it every time you polish your LinkedIn, crop a photo for Instagram, or rehearse an answer for a job interview. You curate the information people see to control the assumptions they make. The difference is that Gus industrializes this instinct. He turns what you do on a profile into a full-scale operating system. Multiple stores, spotless health inspections, charitable donations, photo ops with community leaders. His entire public character is a 24/7 PR campaign. For instance, look at the scenes where he walks through the Dia office, dropping off trays of chicken and cutting checks. On the surface, it's hospitality. Underneath, it's soft surveillance. He's mapping faces, relationships, power structures. Who jokes with who? Who looks stressed? Who mentions a Heisenberg in passing? Information is power, and every handshake with a cop is a data-gathering mission disguised as customer service. By the time Hank is seriously hunting him, Gus already understands Hank's temperament better than Hank understands Gus's. If I had to sum up this phase of Gus's system in one image, it's bulletproof glass. The mask doesn't just hide him, it creates a barrier that forces all future moves to happen on his terms. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation labs, supply chains revenge, can only function because the base layer is socially untouchable. And the terrifying question is, once a man like that has built an unassailable public halo, how do you ever pull him down without setting yourself on fire in the process? That public halo only works if it's backed by infrastructure. And this is where Gus stops being just a careful man and turns into an engineer of reality. If I asked you to point to his operation on a map, you'd probably circle the super lab. But if I had to sum up his real advantage in one word, it's redundancy. So let's examine the empire not as one location, but as three overlapping fronts that all tell the same comforting lie. The first is the obvious one, Los Pollos Hermanos. To the audience, it's a fast food chain. To the Dia, it's tax records, payrolls, and delivery schedules. To Gus, it's a camouflage net. Those chicken trucks? Perfectly legitimate explanations for constant interstate movement, cash deposits, and weirdly precise logistics. Any suspicious route, Any odd delivery time can be buried under the chaos of the restaurant business. Then you have the industrial laundry, the most boring building on earth if you're only reading the paperwork. Massive power usage, industrial equipment, trucks coming and going at odd hours on paper. It all aligns with a huge commercial laundry servicing half the city. In reality, it's the spine of the superlab. That elevator platform, those chemical deliveries, the concrete depth beneath the floor. Every scene down there is a reminder that Gus doesn't hide in the shadows. He hides in plain industrial daylight. And finally, the Charity Foundation. This is the PR shield, the emotional armor. Gus stands in front of cameras, hands oversized checks to law enforcement causes, funds community programs. He turns himself into a pillar of the community, the man who cares about education and safety. If you're a cop, do you really want to be the one to accuse the department's favorite donor of being a cartel mastermind? How many careers are you willing to risk on a hunch? The genius is that none of these fronts exist alone. If Los Pollos gets audited, the foundation still vouches for his character, and the laundry's books remain clean. If the laundry is questioned, the restaurants explain the scale, and the charity explains the money. Every front generates a plausible narrative for suspicious information. Cash flow is successful franchises, truck routes are supply chains, industrial gear is washing capacity, giant facilities are job creators. Which story do you want, officer? Gus has forms ready. Right from the beginning, the writers established that this is an information asymmetry game. Authorities see tax returns, donation photos, health inspections. Only Gus sees the secret overlay, product moving in one direction, money in another, people in both. The audience watches Hank walk through Los Pollos, through the laundry, and you feel the tension because you know he's technically in the right place and still in the wrong world. And that's the pattern. His power never comes from one clever trick or one perfect cover. It comes from layered, overlapping systems that keep working even when one piece is burning. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is what happens when a man who builds redundancy into his buildings starts building it into his wars. When you watch Gus operate, it's tempting to think he's just very good at reacting. A threat appears, he stays calm, he adjusts. But if I had to sum up his real advantage in one line, it would be this. Gus doesn't react to the battlefield. He designs it before the war even starts. So let's examine how that actually looks in Breaking Bad. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Gus is not only running Los Pollos Hermanos, he's running an entire ecosystem. The restaurants, the industrial laundry, the charity foundation, the quiet, meticulous routines, these aren't just covers. They're architecture. They shape what people see, what they say, and what they're even allowed to suspect. If I asked you to list his enemies, you'd talk about cartels and rivals. But in Gus's mind, a suspicious cop, a nosy reporter, even an auditor is an enemy too. And you don't wait for enemies like that. You pre-disarm them. For instance, look at his relationship with law enforcement. Gus doesn't just tolerate cops dropping by, he feeds them. Free meals, warm smiles, handshakes, charity checks with their precinct names on the banner. He shows up at community events. He donates to the D. He walks into their office with trays of chicken and a rehearsed humility that plays perfectly on camera. In that famous scene where he tours the DIA office with Hank, the entire room is already primed to see him as a hero. The information they have on this character is curated: successful businessman, community pillar, generous donor. What that really buys him is not just good PR, it buys him a distortion field. When cops like you, when their families eat your food, when their bosses love your donations, their confirmation bias starts quietly working for you. Evidence doesn't just have to be found, it has to fight through a story that's already emotionally satisfying. Gus Fring, drug kingpin, feels wrong to them, so the burden of proof becomes impossibly high. That's why Hank's early suspicions take so long to harden into action. The battlefield has been tilted. Random tips look less credible. Coincidences get explained away. And every extra day of doubt is another day of control for Gus. But there's a hard ceiling to this kind of manipulation. Optics can bend a narrative, they can slow down an investigation, but they can't stop a bullet in a parking lot. A cartel hit squad does not care about your charity gala. A desperate chemist like Walt does not put down the box cutter because you sponsored a school. So the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is deeper. If external perception is just his surface-level shield, he needs an internal weapon, a way to engineer the people around him as precisely as he engineers his businesses. And the real question becomes, what happens when Gus starts treating his employees, his partners, and even his enemies like moving parts in a machine he already built? If I asked you to picture Gus's enemies, you'd probably think about cartel hit squads, DIA agents, or one very stubborn chemistry teacher. But inside the Empire, his real war is against something way more unstable: human nature. Ego, fear, greed, impulsiveness, those are the variables that blow up operations long before any raid does. So if I had to sum up Gus's internal strategy in one word, it wouldn't be violence. It would be procedure. The first is simple but brutal. In Gus's world, the system is the boss. Not his mood, not his personal grudges, not whatever manipulative speech he could give in a scene. The rules tell you what to do, how to do it, and when to shut up. That's how he stays ahead of people who are walking bundles of emotion. So let's examine his crew. Right from the beginning, the writers established Mike and Tyrus as the anti-Salamancas. Low ego, professional, almost boring. Mike doesn't posture like Tuco. He doesn't scream. He doesn't need to impress the audience. He follows protocol. He does surveillance, gathers information, clears a scene, reports up. When Jesse panics, Mike doesn't argue. He just runs the playbook. Tyrus is the same way at the lab and the laundry. No improvisation, no secret freelancing, just procedure. Contrast that with Tuco or the Salamancas. Tuco turns every minor slight into a life or death test of dominance. Hector will blow up his own body just to prove a point. Their motivation is ego. Gus's motivation is control. That's why his operation looks corporate while theirs looks like a family feud with extra body bags. And this is where the details matter. No phones. No names. Specific meeting spots. The superlab is hidden under a legitimate industrial laundry. Access is controlled. Cameras are everywhere. And even then, people like Jesse only know one slice of the whole. If someone flips, they can only expose their tiny section. If someone breaks, they can only damage one compartment. It's like he's pre-assumed betrayal as a normal outcome and designed around it. Pattern interrupt. Think about your own job. Corporate SOPs, employee handbooks, compliance trainings that everyone pretends to read. In theory, those are there for the same reason, to limit the damage any one person can do when they screw up. The difference is that in your office, violating procedure gets you written up. In Gus's office, violating procedure gets you box cuttered in front of your coworkers. That box cutter scene isn't random cruelty. Victor breaks protocol by being seen at the crime scene and then trying to cook without authorization. Gus doesn't yell. He doesn't deliver a long, manipulative monologue. He just demonstrates the real policy manual. The system is non-negotiable, and anyone who thinks they're bigger than the rules simply ceases to exist. And the terrifying part? This isn't where his control ends. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is what happens when Gus starts using that same procedural mindset, not just to manage his people, but to predict his enemies' choices before they even make them. And that brings us to the purest expression of that mindset: the box cutter sermon. If I asked you to describe that scene, you'd probably talk about the shock. Gus walking in without a word, Walt mid-rant, trying to spin information into leverage, Jesse frozen. And then, without breaking eye contact, Gus changing into lab clothes, picking up that lime green box cutter and opening Victor's throat like it's just another step in the procedure. No speech, no explanation, just controlled butchery. Most people read this as Gus finally snapping. Rage, humiliation, a prideful boss reminding everyone who's in charge. Although there is anger there, if I had to sum up what's really happening in one word, it's calibration. This isn't an outburst, it's a system update. Gus is rewriting the rules of the operation in real time, and he's using Victor's body as the memo. So let's examine what Victor actually did wrong. On the surface, the problem is obvious. Victor was seen at Gail's apartment, hovering around a crime scene, letting witnesses and security cameras drink him in. Sloppy. But that alone doesn't justify this level of punishment in Gus's world. The real offense is that Victor stepped outside his assigned function. He tried to cook. He walked into the superlab and, with this smug confidence, started reproducing Walt's formula without authorization. For Gus, that's the unforgivable secret crime: improvisation. A subordinate rewriting the algorithm. The first is a breach of security. The second is a challenge to the architecture of control itself. If Victor can decide, on his own, that he's now the cook, What stops Tyrus from deciding he's now the manager? Or Walt from deciding he can negotiate terms at gunpoint? Gus is watching his clean hierarchy blur at the edges. So he resets it. Visually, physically, permanently, he strips down, puts on the lab coat, and performs this murder like a ritualized procedure. It's clinical, almost boring in its efficiency, and that's the point. He's telling every character in that room and you, the audience, that the system is sacred, not the people inside it. Loyalty isn't a shield. Competence isn't a shield. If you threaten the integrity of the machine, you're a replaceable part. And that overcorrection is strategic foresight. By turning Victor into a cautionary tale, Gus prevents 100 future mini-Victors from ever emerging. Who's going to improvise now? Who's going to freelance a lie or bend protocol after watching a trusted lieutenant die in silence? This single, horrifying scene locks everyone back into predictable lanes, which is exactly where Gus is strongest. Right from the beginning, the writers establish that when Gus enforces predictability, he can plan 3, 4, 10 moves ahead. But what happens when he finally meets someone who thrives in chaos, who weaponizes unpredictability the same way Gus weaponizes procedure? That's where Walter White stops being just a problem employee and becomes an existential bug in Gus's perfectly coded system. And this is where Gus pulls out a third tool that's even more unnerving than his systems or his surveillance: emotional self-control. Not just being calm. Weaponizing calm, turning silence, stillness, and politeness into the sharpest psychological blade in the room. If I asked you to picture an intimidating cartel boss, you'd probably think of screaming, violence, chaos, Tuco foaming at the mouth, Hector ringing that bell like a demon alarm clock. They're loud, explosive, and to a certain extent, comforting. Because when someone is raging, you can read them. You know when they're about to strike. You can see the fuse burning down. Gus is the opposite. Right from the beginning, the writers establish that his menace is quiet, almost gentle. For instance, watch the scenes where Walter rambles in Gus's office or at the super lab. Walt fills the air with words, excuses, half-truths. Gus just stands there, perfectly still, eyes soft, hands folded, breathing measured. No outbursts, no interruptions, no obvious tells. That emotional flatline forces Walt to keep talking, to reveal more information, to expose his own anxiety. The first is the box cutter moment. If I had to sum up that scene in one word, it wouldn't be violent. It would be controlled. Gus walks in, says almost nothing, changes clothes with ritual precision, and his breathing is so steady it's unnerving. Victor is the one spiraling, trying to justify himself, over-explaining. Gus's silence dictates the tempo. By the time he slashes Victor's throat, the real message isn't the gore. It's that he chose this outcome hours ago and never once lost control. Compare that to Tuco. Tuco's rage is scary but impulsive. You can bait him, stall him, confuse him. Even Hector, for all his cruelty, telegraphs his hatred in every glare and every frantic bell ring. They're emotionally legible, and that makes them manipulable. Gus, on the other hand, is like a blank page you're terrified to write on, because you don't know which word will get you erased. So let's examine that restaurant scene with Hank. Hank sits across from the man he suspects is a killer, and Gus is serving him lunch. Polite, deferential, community-minded. He doesn't argue. He doesn't protest too much. He lets Hank feel in control of the conversation, while calmly reframing himself as the respectable businessman, the charity donor, the pillar of Albuquerque. When one person is emotionally flat and the other is chasing a hunch, the calm one controls the frame, the pace, and even the perceived reality of the scene. And underneath that mask? That's the terrifying part. Because we know Gus is fueled by something intensely personal, the long-term revenge for Max, the slow-motion dismantling of the cartel. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is realizing that this calm is not the absence of emotion. It's emotion frozen, stored, and redirected into decade-long plans. Which raises a darker question. If this is what his control looks like on the surface, what kind of apocalyptic, emotionally charged endgame is he quietly building in the background, and who actually triggers it first? And to answer that question, you have to go back to the pool. Not the nursing home, not the laundry, but that bright, sunlit courtyard where Gus Fring is born in blood. If I asked you to point to the exact frame where his entire motivation crystallizes, it's Max's body hitting the water. Right from the beginning, the writers established that this isn't just a random backstory. The pool scene is Gus's origin wound. You watch Hector shoot Max in the head, you watch the blood arc into the blue water, and you watch Don Eladio smile with this effortless contempt, like he's swatting a fly. And then the camera stays on Gus, on his eyes, on that frozen, shaking composure as Eladio tells him he's being spared because I know who you are. In that moment, survival and humiliation fuse into one permanent scar. So let's examine what actually gets created there. On the surface, you see grief. Underneath, you see a lesson being carved into him at gunpoint. Emotion is a liability, information is power, and the person who chooses when you live or die owns you. Gus walks away from that pool, understanding that if he ever shows rage, if he ever lets the lie of obedience slip too early, he dies. The first is the mask, the polite businessman, the charity donor, the man who hands out chicken and smiles. The second is the blueprint. Bide your time, build leverage, and never, ever forget. This is why that 20-year gap isn't a blank space. It's the real story. He doesn't move on from Max. He industrializes his grief. For instance, Los Pollos Hermanos isn't just a restaurant chain. It's a camouflage system. The industrial laundry isn't just a super lab. It's an underground execution of that poolside promise. Next time, the person kneeling won't be him. Every franchise, every scholarship, every quiet meeting with law enforcement is another brick in a machine designed for one purpose: decapitate the cartel in a single, elegant move. If I had to sum up Gus's entire arc in one phrase, it's extreme delayed gratification. While everyone else in this universe chases fast money or impulsive revenge, Gus is running a 20-year emotional investment fund. He drinks poisoned tequila with Don Eladio because he's already calculated that dying on his own terms to erase an entire organization is better than living one more day under their control. That's not just strategic. That's a man cashing out a revenge plan that's been compounding interest since Max hit the water. And this is where his one-step-ahead reputation comes from. It's not that he predicts every move, it's that he's playing a game whose payoff is measured in decades, not days. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is realizing that once you've built a system that big around a single wound, you're not just controlling others, you're trapped inside your own design, which raises a new problem. What happens when a chaotic element like Walter White collides with a revenge engine that cannot stop? When that revenge engine slams into Walter White, you're really watching two completely different philosophies of power collide. If I asked you to describe Walt's style, you'd probably say chaotic, desperate, brilliant, reckless. If I had to sum up Gus in one word, it's engineered. Both men are geniuses, but one lives minute to minute, and the other designs the minutes months in advance. So let's examine how that actually looks on screen. Walt's superpower is improvisation under pressure. The hydrofluoric acid in the bathtub? That's a panicked, last-second solution to a body problem he didn't plan for, turning a simple cleanup into structural damage and a horrifying punchline. The fulminated mercury in Tuco's office is the same pattern. He walks in surrounded, outgunned, and pulls off a theatrical one-in-a-million bluff that works only because he's willing to risk total annihilation in the middle of a crowded building. You see it again in the RV escape with Hank. Walt and Jesse are cornered. The RV is literally being hauled to an evidence yard, and Walt survives by spinning a lie about Marie being in the hospital. It's manipulative and brilliant, but notice the timing. He's always seconds from disaster. Every victory relies on real-time information, split-second decisions, and the constant threat that one detail goes wrong and he's finished. Gus operates on a completely different clock. Right from the beginning, the writers established that his power comes from slow construction. The Superlab isn't a clever save. It's a multi-million-dollar infrastructure project buried under an industrial laundry, with ventilation, security, and redundancy built in. Recruiting Gale is the same long game. Gus invests in a chemist who can replicate Walt's formula, quietly reducing his dependence on a single volatile asset. And when he moves against the cartel, he doesn't improvise a shootout. He spends years poisoning their trust in their own system, building parallel supply lines, cultivating law enforcement goodwill, and then, in that infamous tequila scene, executing a mass poisoning he's rehearsed down to his own antidote. He literally drinks the same poison because the system is that controlled. Here's the pattern interrupt. If you only focus on who's smarter, you miss why Gus dominates for so long. Engineering beats improvisation in one crucial way. It reduces variance. Systems smooth out randomness. Procedures, loyal crews like Mike and Tyrus, legitimate fronts like Los Pollos, Hermanos, and the laundry. These aren't just aesthetic choices. They're variance killers. Walt's approach amplifies both upside and catastrophic downside. Gus's design narrows the band so that bad days never become fatal. But there's a catch. The first is obvious. Systems are only as flexible as the man who built them. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is realizing that to beat Gus, Walt doesn't have to out-engineer him. He has to drag him out of the system. The only time Walter White can win is when he forces Gus into a nursing home, into Hector's room, into a moment where Gus has to improvise a personal confirmation instead of delegating it. That's the seed of Gus's downfall, and the point where Walt's chaos finally becomes an advantage. Dragging Gus into that nursing home works because it does something his enemies almost never manage to do. It cuts his information feed. If I asked you to pick the one thing that actually keeps Gus alive all those years, it's not the chicken, it's not the lab, it's not even Mike. It's information. Information is oxygen for this character. If I had to sum up Gus's fourth major tool in one phrase, it's information asymmetry. He survives because he knows more, sooner, and in more detail than anyone else in the scene. Walt improvises. The cartel bullies. Hank investigates. Gus monitors. He designs the room, then fills it with cameras, reports, and quiet little pressure gauges that tell him exactly when someone is about to crack. By the time other people are reacting, he's already running projections. So let's examine the hardware first. The Superlab isn't just a production marvel, it's a surveillance cage. Cameras watch Walt and Jesse from multiple angles, feeding live footage upstairs. Gus doesn't have to yell to maintain control. He can just rewind the tape. When Jesse starts slipping, when his motivation wavers, when he comes in high, there's a visual record. The audience sees a sleek lab. Gus sees a dashboard of human variables he can tweak. The first is that camera network. The second is Mike. Right from the beginning, the writers established Mike as security, but in practice, he's Gus's roaming intelligence service. He tails Jesse to NA meetings, sits in cars outside houses, listens more than he speaks, and then reports back in meticulous detail. When Gus wants to know whether Jesse can be turned against Walt, he doesn't guess. He sends Mike into the field and waits for the data. And then there's the soft surveillance, the small talk, the politeness. Every time Gus offers someone a drink, asks about their family, or compliments their work, it feels disarming to them, but it's diagnostic to him. He's sampling their emotional state. For instance, when he sits with Walt at Los Pollos and calmly asks about the lab, he's not being friendly. He's running a stress test, watching Walt's eyes, timing his responses, mapping which lies come easily and which ones snag. This is where the one-way mirror effect kicks in. To his employees, to the DIA, to the community, Gus is a courteous boss and generous donor. They project onto the glass, good citizen, clean record, harmless franchise owner. On his side, though, he's looking in high resolution at their fears, their habits, their weak points. He knows which cop likes free food, which employee drinks, which cartel member is too proud to back down. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is what he does with all that. Information lets him script people without them realizing they're in a script. And in a world where everyone else is guessing, Gus isn't just informed, Gus is running analytics. And that's where Mike Ehrmantraut comes in, because information alone isn't enough. You need a delivery system. Gus has the analytics, but Mike is the sensor array feeding the data in. If I asked you to describe Mike, you'd probably go straight to enforcer, hitman, cleaner. But if I had to sum up his real function in one word, it would be surveillance. Mike turns Albuquerque into Gus's open-air office. He's not just the guy who pulls the trigger, he's the guy who knows where everyone is standing before the gun ever comes out. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Mike is in every shadowy corner of the criminal world without ever being the loudest presence in the room. He watches dealers, cops, informants, even Saul's office traffic, and he does it in a way that never trips alarms, because his entire motivation is control through quiet observation. So let's examine his methods, because they're the opposite of Walt's improvisational chaos. Mike tails people with that slow, unhurried patience, like when he tracks Walt through his daily routine, clocking every stop, every detour. He bugs houses and cars, plants cameras in lab spaces, and sits in parked vehicles for hours just listening. But the hardware is only half the story. The real weapon is his ability to read people's tells, a shaky hand, a bad lie, a change in routine. He clocks Jesse's guilt in half measures before Jesse can even articulate it, and he senses Walt's arrogance growing long before it becomes an open threat. This is where Gus weaponizes Mike's perception. Mike comes back with reports, not drama. No ego, no editorializing, just patterns. The kid's using again. The chemistry teacher's getting bold. Hank Schrader is watching our trucks. Gus doesn't have to guess at human behavior. He outsources that job to a professional observer. For instance, when Mike warns that Walt is a time bomb, Gus doesn't argue. He quietly adjusts the system, contingency plans for a new cook, closer monitoring, emotional management of Jesse. The trust between them is entirely process-based. Mike isn't loyal because he worships Gus as a character. He's loyal because Gus runs a system that respects competence and minimizes stupidity. Mike is not ego-driven, and that's critical. He doesn't need to grandstand. He doesn't lie to make himself look better. He doesn't manufacture crises. The first is always procedure. Secure the scene, gather information, then act. And that's exactly why he fits Gus's philosophy so well. Gus invests in Mike the way a strategist invests in radar. You don't see it. You don't celebrate it. But without it, you're flying blind. Information asymmetry is no longer just about documents, bank records, or phone calls. With Mike, it extends into psychology. Who's scared? Who's angry? Who's about to flip? The terrifying thing for everyone else is that Gus now has a live feed on all of that. While Walt is still trying to read the room, Gus already has the room summarized on a report. But as you'll see next, even a perfect sensor array can be overwhelmed when the variable you're tracking refuses to behave like any previous data point. So if I asked you to picture the superlab, you probably see the gleaming stainless steel, the pristine equipment, the fantasy of every chemist on Earth. But Gus adds one small detail that changes the entire meaning of the room: a single black dome in the ceiling. The camera. The moment that lens appears, the lab stops being a temple to science and becomes a cage with very expensive toys. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Gus doesn't just build spaces, he designs systems of control. The camera isn't flashy, it's silent, always on, feeding information straight to Gus and Mike. No blind spots, no privacy, no off switch that Walt controls. This is supposed to be Walt's kingdom, the place where his genius finally gets the resources it deserves, and yet he's literally framed in every scene as an employee on a security feed. The environment tells you everything. He's not a partner, he's a monitored asset. Psychologically, that's brutal. Walt's self-image is exceptional chemist, the secret genius finally unleashed. But every time he looks up, he's reminded that he's also a lab rat being timed, weighed, and measured. If I had to sum up his internal conflict here in one word, it's humiliation. He knows he's indispensable, but he also knows he's being evaluated like a piece of equipment that can be replaced when a better model arrives. That tension is exactly what Gus wants. Because Gus doesn't just record the cooks, he studies them. So let's examine how manipulative that really is. The footage isn't only about catching intruders or preventing theft. It tracks Walt and Jesse's rhythms, their arguments, their silences. For instance, Gus can see when Jesse drags his feet, when Walt hovers, when they're not speaking. Mike can report they're fighting without hearing a single word. Gus effectively has a behavioral time-lapse of their entire partnership, and that becomes a diagnostic tool for future pressure points. The first is leverage over Walt's pride. Walt thinks his value as the only man who can hit that purity gives him immunity, but the camera quietly hands Gus options. He can test replacements like Gale while still mining Walt's process. He can decide when to punish, when to isolate, when to reward, all based on patterns the audience watches unfold in those sterile fluorescent scenes. Walt believes his genius forces Gus to negotiate. Gus believes his surveillance lets him choose the timing of Walt's elimination down to the day. And this is the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. When your enemy assumes the camera protects him, you've already won. Yet there's a flaw baked into Gus's system. A lens can see behavior, but it can't read intent. It can't see the lie Walt is rehearsing in his head, or the motivation hardening behind that neutral expression. Gus can catalog every motion in that lab, but when Walt finally slips something past that glass eye, The entire system will discover too late that it never really understood what it was watching. And that misunderstanding becomes lethal when you realize Gus never builds just one system. He builds twins, mirror images. While Walt is obsessing over a single batch, Gus is already asking a different question. What happens if this entire pipeline disappears tomorrow? If I asked you to describe Gus's empire at a logistical level, you might say cartel distribution and superlab production like they're phases in a timeline. First one, then the other. But if I had to sum up his real strategy in one word, it's parallel. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Gus isn't replacing the cartel's product with his own, he's running both at the same time. On one side, he's receiving cartel shipments across the border. On the other, he's quietly spinning up his own blue meth operation under the laundry, training Walt and Jesse into high-output machines. So let's examine what that actually buys him. In one scene, he's the respectful subordinate, taking Don Eladio's merchandise, paying the tax, smiling through the humiliation of their shared history. In another, he's walking through the superlab like a plant manager, inspecting equipment, testing systems, making sure this underground factory can one day feed his entire network without a single cartel brick. 2 supply lines, one public to his partners, one essentially a secret. Which one do you think he's really loyal to? The first is raw independence. If the cartel squeezes him, demands more margin, threatens his roots, he can, in theory, pivot away. Not overnight, not without risk, but the option exists because he invested in it years earlier. And the reverse is true as well. If the lab is compromised, if there's a camera he didn't place, a cook he doesn't fully control, he still has those cartel shipments flowing. It's a safety net for his safety net. While every other character is praying their one deal doesn't fall apart, Gus has already built the backup deal and quietly turned it on. Here's the pattern interrupt. Most people think negotiation is about what you say in the room. For Gus, the real negotiation happens months before, in concrete and stainless steel. Because he never needs just one devil, he can stare down multiple devils at once. Don Eladio, the cousins, even Walt. If you can walk away from every table, who really has control? His dual sourcing turns threats into noise. They can hurt him, but they can't own him. That's why the Superlab isn't just a cool set or a plot device. It's a symbol of future-proofing. It's his exit strategy poured into the ground, a quiet revenge plan against the entire cartel system. The audience watches cooks weighing methylamine, but Gus is weighing time how long until this lab makes everyone above him obsolete. And that loops back to our thesis. Staying one step ahead means you don't wait for the crisis to build the exit. You build the exit, then you calmly walk into the crisis. And while that exit is quietly curing underground, Gus is smiling behind a counter, asking if you'd like extra napkins. If I asked you to point to the heart of his empire, you might say the lab, the cartel meetings, the nursing home explosion. But if I had to sum up the real engine of his control in one word, chicken. Los pollos hermanos isn't just camouflage, it's infrastructure. The first is obvious. Trucks. Refrigerated, branded, tracked on paper, and completely uninteresting to anyone who isn't hungry. Right from the beginning, the writers established that this restaurant chain gives him a legitimate reason to move large volumes of product and cash across state lines. For instance, a semi full of frozen tenders and dipping sauce can also carry meth, cash, or chemicals, and every manifest, every route, every delivery time is already justified by the business model. So let's examine how manipulative that actually is. Law enforcement is trained to look for anomalies, weird patterns, unexplained money, off-the-grid vehicles. Gus builds the opposite. Everything about Los Pollos screams predictable. Family combo nights. Lunch rush. Franchise paperwork. The information on the books matches what the cops see with their own eyes. Product and money slide in alongside the legitimate goods, statistically buried in thousands of perfectly clean deliveries. If one truck is suspicious, there are 100 more that look identical and test fine. What do you even charge him with? And then there's the image. This is a place where cops bring their kids, where community leaders shake his hand and thank him for donations. The charity events, the scholarship talk, the photo ops with law enforcement, they're not just PR, they're armor. You watch scene after scene of Gus walking through that dining room, bussing tables, greeting customers, and you can feel the writers daring you to see a monster in a hairnet. Who wants to be the detective who shuts down the beloved chicken place on a hunch? Gus understands that the best lie is the one you help build. By letting the town, the cops, and even the audience participate in the wholesome Los Pollos narrative, he turns their own perception into his alibi. His constant presence at the restaurant is a performance of normalcy. When Hank drops in, Gus is visibly working a normal job, sleeves rolled, talking about supply issues and fryer temps. Meanwhile, the super lab is running, cash is being laundered through the registers, and every security camera doubles as early warning system. Who looks under the stage while the actor is still bowing? And that's the real trick. Gus doesn't hide in the shadows, he hides in the spotlight. He weaponizes visibility. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is that once your enemy believes they've already seen everything there is to see, you can move entire empires right in front of them, and they'll call it lunch. And lunch, for Gus, is never just lunch. It's an alibi with napkins. It's a PR campaign with dipping sauces. Because if I asked you to name the most terrifying thing about Gus Fring, you might go for the box cutter, the cartel massacre, the calm stare. But if I had to sum up his real weapon in one word, access. Gus doesn't wait for law enforcement to come knocking. He invites them in. Literally, you see it in that Feed the Dia scene, agents and officers lining up at Los Pollos Hermanos, laughing, shaking his hand, thanking him for donating food to the office. Hank, the big game hunter of the series, is standing there eating Gus's chicken while praising him as a pillar of the community. That's not background flavor. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Gus's charm offensive is part of the criminal architecture. So let's examine what's actually happening psychologically in those scenes. On the surface, it's just generosity, free food, polite conversation, a smiling businessman asking about their families. Underneath, it's pure manipulative design. Once someone has filed you away as generous, civic-minded, and selfless, their brain starts doing unpaid PR for you. Any future information that contradicts that image feels wrong. It creates dissonance. And the easiest way to resolve that dissonance is not to change the belief. It's to attack the new information. For instance, when Hank later sees Gus's name connected to Gale's lab notes, he doesn't jump straight to drug kingpin. He starts from, that doesn't make sense, Gus is a good guy, and then works backward. The investigation has to climb uphill against Gus's reputation. That's the first and most invisible layer of control. He doesn't just hide evidence, he preloads the investigators with a bias in his favor. And then you get institutional inertia. It's not just one agent liking the chicken, it's a whole building that's eaten his food, taken his checks, shaken his hand. Who wants to be the person who stands up in that environment and says, by the way, I think the beloved local businessman who donates to our events is a cartel boss. If they're wrong, they look paranoid, ungrateful, even unprofessional. So unconsciously, everyone raises the bar of proof without ever saying it out loud. That buys Gus the most valuable commodity in any investigation: time. Every time his name surfaces, people start from doubt about his guilt instead of neutrality. Are we sure it's him? Comes before what if it is him. That tiny delay lets him adjust routes, clean warehouses, move money, or, if needed, personally visit Hector Salamanca with absolute confidence that the system still sees him as the chicken man, not the executioner. And here's the dark irony. The more good Gus appears to do, the more invisible his evil becomes. Every smiling photo, every donation, every tray of free food is another layer of camouflage. By the time the authorities finally see the monster, they have to admit they've been eating his hospitality for years. That's not just a plot twist, that's a humiliation. And humiliation, as we'll see next, is exactly the fuel that turns smart institutions and smart men into reckless ones. Humiliation doesn't just make people angry, it makes them sloppy. And Gus Fring's entire philosophy is built on the opposite impulse. While everyone else in this world lashes out, he prepares. That's why the Tequila Massacre isn't just a cool set piece, it's the purest expression of how far he'll weaponize his own body in the name of control. If I asked you to drink from a bottle you knew was poisoned, you'd call that suicidal. Gus calls it Tuesday, as long as the odds are calculated. In that hacienda scene, he sits with the cartel leadership, watches Don Eladio pour the Zafiro Ajo, and he knows. He has the information. He knows they tampered with the bottle, knows they expect him to die first. And he still raises the glass, smiles, and drinks deeply. The audience reads it as madness on first viewing. On rewatch, it's not madness. It's paperwork. So let's examine the preparation hidden inside that one swallow. Gus doesn't trust fate. He trusts systems. Before he ever sets foot on cartel territory, he's pre-medicated with an antidote, coached on dosage and timing. He has his own doctor waiting nearby, a full medical setup ready to intervene the second he stumbles back across the border. He's rehearsed this outcome the way Walt rehearses a lie in the car mirror. If I had to sum up his motivation in that moment, it's simple. Convert personal risk into structural freedom. Because the trade-off is brutal but logical. Short-term, he is deliberately ingesting a lethal dose of poison. Long-term, the payoff is the total decapitation of the cartel leadership that murdered his partner and has controlled his operation for decades. This isn't a power grab in the abstract. It's the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation he's been climbing since that poolside execution in his past. One night of agony for a lifetime without answering to Don Eladio. In Gus's ledger, that math is cold, but clean. What makes the scene almost supernatural is his emotional control while the poison takes hold. Men start collapsing, clutching their throats, vomiting into the pool. The camera lingers on Gus, sweating, breathing harder, but upright. He straightens his tie. He walks out under his own power, as if sheer discipline can hold his cells together. Right from the beginning, the writers establish that his calm isn't just a personality trait, it's a weapon. The myth of his invincibility is born right there, in the gap between when everyone else falls and when he finally drops to his knees behind the car. But here's the uncomfortable question. Is this caution taken to its logical extreme, or is it just another form of reckless gambling dressed up in lab results and contingency plans? He's still betting his life. He's still trusting that no secret variable ruins the equation. And as we'll see, once you start staking your survival on perfect preparation, all it takes is one man who thrives on chaos to flip the table. So once you see that, you have to ask, is Gus actually cautious, or is he just reckless on a longer timeline? If I asked you to describe him, you'd probably say controlled, patient, precise, but if I had to sum up his real operating system in one word, it's risk. Calculated, delayed, beautifully disguised risk. Because Gus does take enormous gambles. He just buries them under layers of procedure until they feel safe. The first is his entire double life. This is a man who runs a public-facing fried chicken chain, appears at charity events, shakes hands with law enforcement, and simultaneously oversees a meth empire and a private war against the cartel. That's not caution. That's a high-wire act performed in fluorescent lighting in front of an unsuspecting audience, with no net. So let's examine the nursing home visit to Hector, because that scene quietly exposes how far his caution will bend when his need for control is on the line. Gus doesn't send Tyrus alone. He doesn't accept secondhand information about Hector's condition. He personally walks into a building tied to the Salamanca name, a place the cartel has already used as a pressure point, because he trusts his own planning more than he trusts delegation. He believes his systems are so airtight that enemy territory is only enemy territory for other people. On paper, it looks careful. He does a perimeter check. He brings muscle. He watches Hector for tells. But underneath all that, the motivation is almost emotional. He needs to see his enemy broken with his own eyes. He needs to control the final scene of their rivalry. That psychological comfort of control is his drug. If he's the one engineering the variables, he's willing to accept far higher danger. The risk doesn't feel like risk if he designed the experiment. Pattern interrupt. Compare that to Walter White. Walt's gambles are loud, messy, impulsive. He walks into Tuco's office with fulminated mercury. He runs over 2 dealers in broad daylight. He poisons Brock on a hunch that Jesse will connect the dots he wants. Gus looks like the opposite, but functionally they're doing something very similar. Both men are constantly betting their lives. Walt does it with improvisation and raw nerve. Gus does it with data, routines, and rehearsed responses that make every leap feel rational. And right from the beginning, the writers established that this difference in style would matter more than the difference in intent. Walt's chaos keeps him unpredictable. Gus's structure makes him predictable at the exact moments he insists on being present. That's the tragic irony the show builds toward. The same need to personally control high-stakes moments, the same refusal to outsource the truly important moves will eventually place Gus in the one room, on the one day, at the 1 second, where Walt's manipulative chaos is waiting. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is watching how Walt learns to weaponize Gus's caution against him. And this is where the machine meets the glitch. For all of Gus's discipline, his biggest problem isn't the cartel, or the DIA, or even Hector Salamanca. It's Walter White, because Walter is the one variable Gus's system was never designed to process. If I asked you to describe Gus's ideal employee, you'd picture someone like Gale or Mike, competent, low ego, procedure-obsessed, content to live in the shadows of someone else's empire. The first is a scientist who sings in the lab and thanks his boss for the opportunity. The second is an ex-cop who follows orders and files reports. Walt walks in as the opposite: high-value output, high-volatility personality, and an ego that refuses to be quietly managed. Right from the beginning, the writers established this clash through those early meetings. Gus's initial offer at Los Pollos is almost comically rational. Huge money, total protection, clear boundaries. Walt refuses, not because the information is bad or the risk is too high, but because his pride has been wounded by Jesse, by Skylar, by his entire life. Gus is dealing with motivation as a cost-benefit equation. Walt is dealing with motivation as a lifelong wound. So let's examine how Gus frames him. At first, Walt is talent. Exceptional, yes. Indispensable, no. Gus keeps Gale in the wings, builds the super lab as a modular system, and talks about cooks like interchangeable components. If I had to sum up Gus's attitude in one word, it's replaceable. Even when he's impressed, he never stops treating Walt as a part in a larger machine he ultimately controls. That underestimation is the crack. Because what Gus doesn't fully grasp is that Walt is willing to run plays no sane employee would ever consider. Killing Gale is the perfect example. It's not just murder. It's a suicidal-level gambit that only makes sense if you're prepared to die, rather than lose control. Gus's entire philosophy relies on the assumption that people want to survive, keep their income, and avoid chaos. Walt will burn his own life down if it means he gets to choose the match. You see this blindness in the box cutter scene. Gus thinks a single terrifying demonstration will reset the hierarchy. He kills Victor, reasserts control, and expects compliance. Walt, shaking and bloody, walks out more convinced than ever that he must destroy this man. Gus reads fear and assumes obedience. The audience sees fear curdling into long-term, obsessive plotting. For instance, look at their quiet conversations in the lab. Gus offers calm, logical arguments: work, earn, be safe. Walt counters with emotional lies to himself about family, with secret plans involving Jesse, with manipulative speeches about freedom. Gus keeps trying to solve a psychological problem with structural incentives, as if a better benefits package will neutralize a man who just orchestrated an execution to maintain leverage. In a world built on predictability and routine, one truly irrational player can be more dangerous than an entire cartel. Gus designed the room. Walt is the guy who walks in and is willing to blow the room up. And the next section is where you see how Walt starts planting that bomb, long before Gus ever smells the fuse. Walt is lighting the metaphorical fuse, but Gus is already doing what he always does. When there's even a chance of an explosion, he's building a fireproof room around himself. And that room has a name: Gale Buttisher. If I asked you to design Gus Fring's ideal cook from scratch, you wouldn't end up with Walter White. You'd end up with Gale. No ego, no secret agenda, no manipulative power plays. Just a grateful, scientifically competent chemist who sings along to Italian opera and thanks his boss for the chance to work. Right from the beginning, the writers established Gale as the anti-Walt in every meaningful way. He's loyal, he's methodical, and he actually respects boundaries. So let's examine Gus's motivation here, because it's not just about getting good product. It's about eliminating a bargaining chip. Gus understands that Walt's true leverage isn't a gun. It's information and uniqueness. Only he can make the 99.1% blue. So the first is obvious. Use Walt to perfect the process, to squeeze every last bit of knowledge out of that volatile genius brain. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is less obvious but way more dangerous. Quietly transfer that knowledge into a version of Walt who will never challenge him. You see this in every Gale scene. For instance, when Gale is back in the lab, he's not just assisting, he's shadowing. He's taking meticulous notes, labeling everything, building a written system that can survive without any one person. Gus has Walt walk him through procedures, timings, temperatures, all under the guise of efficiency. On the surface, it's just good management. Underneath, it's a slow-motion execution of Walt's leverage. And Gus manages this transition with the same cold precision he brings to the cartel war. He doesn't fire Walt in a blaze of anger. He schedules him. He lets Gale ramp up while Walt ramps down, overlapping their shifts, embedding redundancy. The lab becomes a machine that can, in theory, run indefinitely, with Gale as the friendly, low-ego operator who never lies, never improvises, never forces his boss to make a messy public move. If Gus finishes this plan, Walt is done. No more I am the one who knocks, because there's nothing to knock with. His value as a cook evaporates, his information advantage disappears, and Gus regains total control. Walt stops being an indispensable asset and becomes what Gus always wanted him to be, a problem that can be cleaned up. And that's exactly why this almost perfect redundancy system backfires. The more complete Gale becomes as a replacement, the more trapped Walt feels. What do you do when your only power is about to be deleted from the system? You escalate. You become irrational. You do the one thing Gus's beautifully ordered world can't account for. You point Jesse Pinkman at the backup plan and tell him to pull the trigger. But how Walt gets Jesse to that point, and what he has to destroy inside Jesse to make it possible, is where Gus's control finally meets its match. And this is where Gus makes his rare, fatal mistake. He thinks he's dealing with a piece on the board, not a person on the edge. To Gus, Jesse is a junkie with decent hands, a temporary asset whose addiction and volatility make him, in the long term, disposable. That's his miscalculation. He can't see that Jesse's real addiction isn't just to drugs. It's to approval, to Walt's validation, to the idea that he isn't irredeemable. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Gus reads people through a professional lens. He understands workers, soldiers, businessmen. He understands loyalty built on money, fear, or mutual interest. But Jesse? Jesse is a traumatized, self-loathing wildcard whose motivation shifts with every betrayal. If I asked you to design a character specifically to break a hyper-rational system, you'd end up with someone exactly like him. So let's examine how Walt turns that into a weapon. Gus builds redundancy with Gale, a calm, rational professional who follows instructions, keeps his head down, and doesn't need emotional hand-holding. In Gus's mind, this is elegant, clean, replaceable, but Walt sees the hidden lever. The first is Jesse's guilt over Jane, over Combo, over every death that's touched him. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is fear. Fear of abandonment, of being the bad guy forever. Walt fuses those together. He doesn't just tell Jesse, "You have to kill Gale or we die." He frames it as a grotesque act of loyalty, a perverse chance at redemption. For instance, he leans into Jesse's belief that he ruins everything, then twists it. "If you don't do this, we die, and it will be your fault." Suddenly, the gun in Jesse's hand isn't just a weapon, it's a test of whether he can finally do something that matters. And then we get to that scene at Gale's door. This is the emotional explosion Gus never sees coming, because no spreadsheet can model it. Jesse rings the bell. His hand shakes. His breathing is ragged. The camera lingers on Gale's face. Open, kind, unsuspecting. There's a split second where you can feel Jesse's entire nervous system screaming to abort. He doesn't want this. He's panicking. The hesitation stretches just long enough for the audience to think, he can't do it, right? Pattern interrupt, he pulls the trigger. In that moment, Gus's perfect redundancy evaporates, not through a rival cartel or a law enforcement raid, but through one damaged kid's shattered psyche. If I had to sum up the structural flaw in Gus's empire, it's this. His system assumes rational actors. He can control professionals, manage secrets, and predict self-interest. What he can't reliably control is a person whose self-interest is self-destruction. For the first time, Gus isn't one step ahead. He's one step behind an emotional chain reaction he didn't anticipate and can't immediately contain. And once you understand that, you can see how every move he makes after Gale's death is no longer pure design, it's forced adaptation. And that shift is exactly what Walt needs for his next move. And that's exactly why Gus pivots. If I asked you to pinpoint the moment he realizes the old plan is dead, it's not just Gale's body on the floor, it's Jesse. Shaking, traumatized, but still obedient. Right from the beginning, the writers established Gus as a man who treats people as interchangeable parts. Now, for the first time, he understands Jesse is not a disposable cog. He's leverage. He's opportunity. He's the only way to regain control of a system Walt just blew up. So Gus does something that feels almost sentimental but is actually brutally strategic. He starts investing in Jesse. Not with hugs and speeches, but with structure. Responsibility, praise. He sends Jesse out with Mike on collections. Lets him hold a gun, gives him a role that isn't just Walt's flunky in the lab. On the surface, it looks like rehabilitation. Underneath, it's a calculated countermove. If I had to sum up the motivation, it's simple. Separate the partners by giving the weaker one what the stronger one withholds. Because what does Gus offer that Walt never consistently gives? Respect without constant belittlement. For instance, in those desert scenes with Mike, when Jesse spots the staged ambush and plows the car into the gunmen, Gus doesn't mock him, doesn't call him an idiot, doesn't rehash every past screw-up. He quietly promotes him, trusts him with more information, more responsibility. The audience watches Jesse's posture change. He stands straighter, talks with less apology. Under Gus's cold mentorship, his confidence starts to look functional. So let's examine what that does to Walt. The first is obvious. It undercuts his emotional monopoly. Walt has always controlled Jesse through a toxic cocktail of validation and abuse, mixing truth and lie until Jesse can't tell which is which. Gus slices right through that by offering a cleaner deal: work hard, follow procedure, get treated like a professional. No theatrics, no gaslighting. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is that Gus doesn't need Jesse to love him. He just needs Jesse to stop reflexively defending Walt. You see this most clearly in the cartel hit arc. Gus brings Jesse into the heart of his long-term war, has him cook in Mexico, then stand by while he poisons the cartel with that tequila. That's not a throwaway scene, it's an initiation. Jesse is no longer the screw-up mascot. He's standing next to Gus and Mike as a critical asset who has earned his place in the inner circle. From Gus's perspective, he's converted a liability into a potential long-term lieutenant. But here's the limit Gus can't see. He still treats the Walt-Jesse bond as a simple variable to be reweighted, not as a volatile chemical reaction. He underestimates how deeply Walt's manipulation has fused guilt, loyalty, and self-hatred inside Jesse, and how far Walt will go to weaponize that again. Gus can redesign the room, but Walt is already busy rewiring the bomb under the floorboards, and Jesse is still the explosive in the middle. And that explosive is exactly what Gus thinks he can contain, because he's dealt with human dynamite before. If I asked you to name the purest form of chaos in this universe, you'd probably land on one word: Salamanca. Right from the beginning, the writers established the Salamancas as the anti-Gus. Tuco, Hector. The cousins, they're not businessmen, they're not planners, they're not interested in information or logistics. They're honor, rage, and ego with guns attached. Tuco snorts meth in the office and pistol whips his own men for fun. The cousins wordlessly crawl to a shrine and then stalk their prey like horror movie monsters. Hector rings a bell and orders executions over trivial slights. Where Gus is systems and silence, they're impulse and spectacle. And that's exactly what he despises. So let's examine how someone who worships procedure handles an enemy that worships emotion. The first is that he refuses to fight them on their terms. You never see Gus storming a compound or screaming about respect. Instead, he uses patience as a weapon, letting time and structure do what bullets can't. He builds his own distribution network, his own super lab, his own loyal crew with Mike and Tyrus, and quietly erodes Salamanca relevance until the cartel needs him more than he needs them. On the surface, he's the polite chicken man, but every Los Pollos truck is another data point, another step in a long game of suffocation. For instance, look at the cousins' attempted hit on Hank. That entire sequence is Gus weaponizing Salamanca fury while keeping his own hands technically clean. He leaks just enough information, just enough of a secret, to point them at Hank instead of Walt. He allows their honor code blood for blood to play out, but on a battlefield he controls. Then, at the last second, he warns Hank through an anonymous call, engineering a public shootout that cripples the cousins and makes law enforcement crack down on cartel muscle, not on his pristine operation. It's the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. Redirect instead of resist. At the center of all this stands Hector. To Gus, Hector isn't just an enemy lieutenant, He's a personal tormentor, the man who mocked his partner's murder and shattered his old life. If I had to sum up Hector's role in one word, it's obsession. Gus visits him in the nursing home not because it's efficient, but because it feeds a private motivation his usual self-control can't fully smother. Every monologue in Spanish, every calm description of how the Salamancas are being erased, is both tactical and therapeutic. And that's where the irony starts to coil. The same Hector who becomes Gus's greatest strategic trophy, silenced, immobilized, forced to watch his family's empire crumble, is also the only character he can't treat as a pure variable. He thinks he has total control of the board, but what happens when another manipulative mind realizes that this one broken old man is the crack in Gus's armor? So when you follow that crack in Gus's armor all the way to its source, it doesn't start in a nursing home, it starts at a pool. The same blue rectangle that watched Max bleed out is the place Gus chooses to end the cartel. If I asked you to picture one image that sums up Gus Fring's motivation, it's him kneeling beside Max's body while Don Eladio smiles. If I had to sum up the return trip in one word, reversal. Because right from the beginning the writers established that Gus is not an improviser, he's an engineer. He doesn't just want revenge, he wants revenge that passes inspection. So let's examine that pool meeting from his perspective. He's not just walking into enemy territory. He's walking into a controlled experiment he's been designing for decades, where every variable except one has already been locked down. The first is the poison itself. This isn't some last-minute idea. He secures a toxin strong enough to wipe out a courtyard of bosses, but subtle enough to pass as bad tequila. He times the meeting so the cartel feels triumphant, not threatened. They think they've forced him back into line with their own product, that they've broken the proud businessman and dragged him to heel. Information asymmetry again. They know he's afraid of them. He knows they're already dead. Watch how he manages his own body like another piece on the board. Before he ever sets foot on that property, he premedicates, building a partial resistance. It won't save him from suffering, but it will buy him minutes. And in a scene like this, minutes are everything. He rehearses the ritual, drink, toast, pretend to relax. Then the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is invisible. He simply waits for biology to do what biology does. And even in the middle of that chaos, he's planned extraction. Mike is positioned, the car is ready, the route out is known. This is not Walter White blowing up Tuco's headquarters with a bag of fulminated mercury. This is a man who operates 3 fronts, knows every border crossing, and has built redundancy into his own escape. The symbolic reversal is brutal. The first time, the pool is a stage for humiliation. Gus is forced to watch, powerless, as his partner is executed and his identity reduced to a warning. Now, the water reflects bodies falling, glasses shattering, Don Eladio clawing at his throat. The same setting, the same ritual, but the lie has flipped. Gus is the one smiling through pain while they choke on their confidence. His walk away from the bathroom is almost grotesque. He's collapsing internally, vomiting, barely able to stand, but his composure is still a weapon. He straightens his tie, steps out into a courtyard of corpses, and only then allows his body to fail. The plan has succeeded in totality. His physical weakness is irrelevant once the information has rippled out. The cartel is leaderless. The empire that mocked him is now a logistical problem to be absorbed. And this is Gus at his most one step ahead. A revenge so slow and thorough that by the time his enemies realize he's not under their control, they're already dying. But the same obsession that lets him erase an entire cartel in one night is also what keeps pulling him back to Hector, to that original wound, and that's where Walter finds his opening. And that's the irony. The night Gus pulls off his perfect revenge, he also clears the board so cleanly that he stops seeing how dangerous a single leftover piece can be. After Don Eladio and his lieutenants collapse around that pool, the post-cartel landscape is almost absurdly favorable to Gus. The Southwest pipeline is his. Distribution, logistics, transport across the border. He's effectively turned what used to be a fragile partnership into a vertically integrated empire. Los Pollos Hermanos, the industrial laundry, the charity foundation, each front is now a node in a system no one else really understands. If I asked you to name another serious rival in that territory after the massacre, could you? The answer is the problem, because right from the beginning the writers established that Gus's identity was shaped by looking up. Don Eladio above him, Salamanca beneath that. The constant awareness that one wrong move could get him executed in someone else's backyard. His whole psychology is built on surviving under a power structure. Now he stands at the top of it. No more Mexican bosses to placate. No more fragile truces, only subordinates and customers. That's a very different kind of pressure, and it changes what being careful looks like. If I had to sum up this shift in one word, it would be narrowing. Before, Gus scans for empires. After, he's scanning for leaks. The first is a paranoid, outward-facing vigilance. The second is managerial. He's still meticulous, still cold, but his risk assessment tilts toward consolidation. Standardize the superlab, lock in supply lines, keep the DIA at bay, replace Walt with Gale 2.0. He's not asking, what new asymmetrical threat could appear? He's asking, how do I stabilize what I already own? On paper, that sounds rational. In a world with Walter White, it's lethal. So let's examine what Walter represents in this new landscape. At first, Walt is just one variable in a huge equation, a talented cook with an expiration date. Gus has already proven he can phase out assets methodically, Victor, the cartel, even Gale in the short term. Walt is supposed to be the same. Train Jesse, refine the process, then eliminate the unstable element with minimal noise. From Gus's perspective, that's not even manipulative, it's hygiene. Here's the pattern interrupt. What happens when your entire life has trained you to fight cartels, and your last real enemy is a desperate chemistry teacher with nothing left to lose? Gus is optimized to counter institutions. He builds systems, hoards information, designs redundancy. Walt is the opposite. He's improvisation, emotional volatility, and nuclear-level escalation in a single, furious person. You can't audit that. You can't just send Mike to handle that and expect the board to stay still. And the audience can feel it. With the cartel gone, every remaining problem in Gus's world has one name on it. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation isn't a bigger war, it's a smaller one. One man, one bomb, one moment in a nursing home. The question is no longer can Gus beat an empire, it's can he even see Walt coming now that there's no empire left to hide behind. If I asked you to name the one person on the show who should have taken Gus Fring down, you probably wouldn't say Walter White. You'd say Hank Schrader. Because on paper, Hank is the exact kind of predator Gus has built his whole life to avoid. Relentless, experienced, and finally willing to look past the polite smile and the free chicken. Right from the beginning, the writers established that law enforcement loves Gus. He donates to the DIA, shakes hands at charity events, feeds the squad, and plays the humble immigrant success story. Most agents buy the act. Hank is the first lawman who doesn't completely. He's the one who looks at Gale's lab notebook, sees the Los Pollos Hermanos logo, and feels that tiny itch of suspicion that this seemingly perfect businessman doesn't quite add up. So let's examine how Gus responds when that itch turns into a focused investigation. The first is over-cooperation. When Hank calls him in, Gus doesn't lawyer up, doesn't get defensive, doesn't flinch. He sits down, folds his hands, and calmly admits just enough. Yes, he met Gale. Yes, he supported him. Yes, he cares about chemistry and community outreach. Every answer is a partial truth, a carefully curated slice of information that makes Hank feel like he's getting somewhere, while Gus keeps the real secret buried. Watch that interrogation scene closely. Hank pushes. He mentions the notebook, the fast food connection, the timing. Gus responds by leaning harder into charm and vulnerability. He offers condolences, compliments Hank's work, even pretends to be slightly hurt by the implication. It's manipulative, but it's subtle. He's not trying to crush Hank's suspicion. He's trying to make Hank doubt his own instincts. If I had to sum up Gus's strategy here in one word, it's controlling what Hank sees, what he hears, and crucially, how confident he feels about any of it. For instance, when Hank puts the GPS tracker on Gus's car, you expect panic. Instead, Gus strolls into the DIA office and hands it back. On the surface, it's pure cooperation. Look, I found this on my car, I have nothing to hide. Underneath, it's a psychological counterattack. He flips the power dynamic. Suddenly, Hank is the one who looks overeager, even paranoid, in front of his colleagues. How sure are you now, Hank? And Gus keeps adapting in near real time. The minute he knows he's under surveillance, he adjusts his routes, his meetings, his exposure. He lets Hank follow the legitimate fronts, the restaurant, the charity foundation, The laundry, because those are clean enough to survive scrutiny. It's the same information game Walt plays with his family, just executed with corporate polish and zero ego. The crucial thing is this: Hank doesn't actually beat Gus. He corners him only when Walt secretly feeds him the missing pieces, weaponizing his brother-in-law's investigation against his own boss. Without Walt planting evidence and nudging Hank toward the truth, Gus's respectable mask probably holds. So even in his most vulnerable cat and mouse with law enforcement, Gus is still almost one step ahead. The real threat isn't the Dia outside his system, it's the unpredictable chemist already inside his carefully designed room. And that's exactly why the tracker moment hits so hard. For once, the room that Gus designed pushes back on him. Walt has nudged Hank toward the truth. The investigation is no longer fully under Gus's control, and suddenly the man who lives on information asymmetry discovers a secret on his own car. You remember the scene. Gus walks out to his Volvo, spots the GPS device tucked under the bumper, and just pauses. No outburst. No scramble. Just that tiny surgical beat where you watch his mind reconfigure the board. Then he does something that feels insane on first viewing. He calmly removes the tracker, drives straight to the Dia office, and walks it into Hank Schrader's lap. So let's examine what that actually is. On paper, this is evidence against him. Physical proof that someone in law enforcement suspects Gustavo Fring enough to track his movements. The logical reaction would be to panic, to destroy it, to tighten routines. Gus does the opposite. He weaponizes it. By showing up voluntarily, smiling, asking if his car is being tracked, he transforms incriminating information into a loyalty test for Hank and a performance for the audience inside the show. If I asked you to design the perfect alibi move, this would be pretty close. Because only an innocent man would brazenly reveal he's being watched, right? That's the psychological message. The first is simple. He signals total confidence, as if he has nothing to hide. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is deeper. He flips the narrative so that Hank feels like the one who has to justify his suspicion. Gus never directly accuses, but the implication is clear. If you thought I was dirty, would I really walk in here and hand you the tracker? Right from the beginning, the writers established Gus as a character who stays ahead by never reacting emotionally in the moment. Box cutter, cartel meetings, even Hector Salamanca's insults, he absorbs the hit now, retaliates later on his own timetable. This scene is different. He is still composed, but his motivation has shifted from pure offense to controlled damage management. He is responding to a move he did not script. If I had to sum up this moment in one word, it would be backwards. For the first time, Gus literally and metaphorically looks back. He inspects his car. He retraces the chain of events that put that device there. The camera lingers on him in a way that invites you to see the crack, the slightest tightening of the jaw, the awareness that his anonymity is compromised. It's not fear, but it is real vulnerability. And that's the quiet horror. Once a man like Gus starts looking over his shoulder, the entire system he built has to bend with him. Routines adjust, meetings change, people get scrutinized. The illusion of untouchability is gone. The only question is, if he's already turning his head, how long before someone finally catches up, and what does a control freak like Gus do when he realizes he might be running out of road? So when Gus starts to feel that road running out, the writers don't send him to a boardroom or a lab. They send him to a nursing home. If I asked you to pick the least threatening location in this entire show, you'd probably point to that beige, fluorescent hallway with the slow-moving wheelchairs and the board TV in the corner. And that's exactly why this scene is so brutal. The most controlled man in Breaking Bad walks into the softest space on the board and treats it like he still owns the game. The first is his decision to go there himself. After learning Hector's cooperating with the Dia, Gus has lieutenants, cameras, and layers of insulation he could use. But he doesn't. He drives to Casa Tranquila, steps out in that immaculate suit, and personally rides the elevator up. On paper, the motivation is practical. Close a potential leak, assess the damage, make sure no secret slips that could expose his operation. But you can feel the emotional gravity under it. This isn't just risk management. This is ritual. So let's examine what he thinks he's doing in that room. Gus believes he's there to reassert dominance, to remind Hector that even talking to federal agents can't save him. He wants to savor it. The way he stands over the bed, the measured cadence of his speech, the way he describes wiping out the cartel and killing his family in front of him years earlier. This is a man replaying his favorite victory for an audience of one. If I had to sum up his motivation, it's control flavored as revenge theater. And because of that, his read on Hector is disastrously confident. Gus thinks this character is solved, broken, powerless, emotionally predictable. For years, Hector's entire world has been that chair, that bell, that blank stare. Gus has used him as a prop, a living trophy. So when Hector's eyes track him, when the bell rings in angry staccato, Gus reads it as familiar hatred, not new information. He assumes he knows every beat of this man's emotional range. Here's the pattern interrupt. For once, Gus trusts the environment. In a show where he bugged cars, controlled warehouses, and designed entire industrial laundries to hide his secrets, he walks into a state-run nursing home like it's neutral ground. He trusts the staff. He trusts the routine. He trusts that his own past thoroughness makes surprise impossible. No frisking Hector. No sweeping the room. No second exit strategy. He has rehearsed this visit in his mind so many times that the scene feels safe. And that's the tragic irony. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Gus wins because he designs the room. The super lab, the chicken restaurants, the cartel meeting with the poisoned tequila, those are his arenas, his rules. But here, he steps into someone else's room and assumes his rulebook still applies. He doesn't ask who moved Hector, who arranged the meeting, who benefits from this exact configuration of bed, bell, and visitor. By the time he realizes that the bell he's mocked for years is now a detonator, it's already too late. And the terrifying question for you as an audience member is, once the architect of the board starts playing on Walt's board instead, what does that say about who's really one step ahead now, and how far is Walt willing to go to flip every one of Gus's strengths against him? And this is where Walt does something Gus's beautifully engineered board can't account for. He stops thinking like a businessman and starts thinking like a disease. If I asked you to build a model that predicts cartel moves, dia pressure, even random street violence, you could do it. But can you model the motivation of a dying man whose entire identity is hatred? When Walt walks into that nursing home, he's not just looking at Hector Salamanca. He's studying pure, undiluted vengeance in human form. Right from the beginning, the writers established Hector as someone who would rather burn his own house down than lose face. And Walt reads that correctly. The man who refused to cooperate with the dia. The man who rang his bell to spell out obscenities instead of information. Walt realizes that Hector's hatred for Gus is deeper than any fear of death, prison, or pain. That's the opening. So let's examine how manipulative this really is. Walt doesn't just ask Hector to help. He weaponizes the last thing Hector has left, his grudge. The first is the psychological pitch. Walt dangles the one outcome Hector still cares about Gus dead. No freedom, no deal, no lie about witness protection, just revenge. Then comes the engineering. He hides the explosive under Hector's wheelchair, wires it to that mocking little bell, and turns a mobility aid into a dead man's switch. Every ring is now a countdown the audience can hear, but no one on screen fully understands until it's too late. This is asymmetry in its purest form. It's not a cartel hit with layers of soldiers and backup plans. It's not a dia sting with warrants and surveillance. It's a personal vendetta, wrapped in science, powered by desperation. If I had to sum up the plan in one word, it's reckless. If any piece fails, the bomb, the wiring, Tyra spotting something, Gus deciding not to come, Walt dies. There's no second team, no alternate site, no graceful exit. One room, one man, one bell. Contrast that with Gus. His entire life is redundancy, parallel supply lines, multiple fronts, trusted lieutenants like Mike and Tyrus, even drinking poisoned tequila as part of a carefully calculated cartel massacre. He survives by assuming everyone else is rational, that threats will seek profit, safety, or leverage. But how do you defend against someone who's already lost everything and is willing to hand a terminal old man the trigger? In that final nursing home scene, the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is that Walt stops being a predictable opponent and becomes an irrational variable. Gus's systems are built to absorb rational pressure. Walt wins by feeding chaos directly into the one place Gus still insists on personal control. And the question hanging over the next part of the story is unsettling. Once you've proven you can beat a perfect system by becoming the thing it can't model, what won't you do next? And that's why Gus's death can't just be a plot twist, it has to be a thesis statement. If I asked you to picture the moment Gus finally loses, your brain doesn't jump to the explosion itself. It jumps to the walk. The scene is brutally simple. The bomb goes off in Hector's room, the whole wing of the nursing home shudders, alarms start screaming, smoke pours into the hallway. For a second, the camera just holds on chaos. You don't see Gus. You only feel the absence of the man who's always 10 steps ahead. Then, out of the cloud, he appears. Calm, upright, composed, he steps into the frame like he's leaving a business meeting. Not a war crime. No stumbling, no screaming, no desperate clutching at his body. The lighting is flat, the sound muffled, and your brain fills in the gap with every previous scene where Gus walked away unscathed because his systems, his information, his discipline protected him. For that one suspended second, the audience is allowed to believe he did it again. And then he adjusts his tie. That tiny gesture is the most manipulative visual lie in the entire series. If I had to sum up the essence of Gus's character in one motion, it's that. The hand comes up automatically, like muscle memory. He's not checking for wounds, he's reasserting control over the mask. The writers shoot it in profile, delaying the reveal, because they want you to experience the same illusion Gus has lived inside for decades, that presentation can override reality, that composure can outvote mortality. So let's examine why it's so haunting. For an instant, the information your eyes have, man standing, tie straightening, posture steady, contradicts what you know should be true after that explosion. Your brain chooses the mask over the math, and then the camera swings, and half his face is gone. The tie is perfect, the body is not. The system held, until it didn't. This is the visual metaphor for his entire character. Right from the beginning, the writers established Gus as the man who designs the room. Parallel supply lines, redundant fronts, loyal employees trained to suppress ego and impulse. The first is the restaurant. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is the superlab. Then the charity foundation, all carefully engineered to project stability, respectability, invincibility. But under all that structure is a single fragile assumption, that he can always maintain control. The tie adjustment is his final attempt to enforce that assumption. Even as his nervous system collapses, the habit of the mask fires one last time. It's poetic, but it's also pathetic. This is a man so committed to image that his dying instinct is to fix his presentation to an empty hallway. And that's the irony that kills him. He doesn't die because he's outsmarted in raw intellect. He dies because his need to personally confirm, personally punish, personally control Hector drags him into the one place his systems can't protect him. He never truly models his own ego as a variable. So the question hanging over Walt after that hallway reveal is chilling. If the man who engineered everything still fell to his own need for control, what happens to the man who just learned that lesson and doesn't see it as a warning, but as permission? If I asked you to list Gus Fring's strengths, you'd probably hit all the classics. Discipline, patience, control, planning, information. He's the anti-Walt in almost every way. Where Walt is chaotic and improvisational, Gus is engineered down to the last contingency. But in Breaking Bad, the thing that saves you in one scene is already being sharpened as the knife that kills you in another. If I had to sum up Gus's superpower in one word, it's systems. Right from the beginning, the writers established that everything about him is layered. Los Pollos as a civic halo, the laundry as a logistical ghost, the charity foundation as moral camouflage. His crew is disciplined, low ego, relentlessly professional. His information networks run through Mike, through the DIA, through quiet surveillance. On top of that, he has near-total emotional control and a long-term motivation that spans decades of revenge against the cartel. So let's examine how each of those pillars quietly turns on him. The first is his reliance on procedure. Systems make him efficient, but they also make him slow to adapt when someone refuses to play by the rules of his game. Walt is dangerous, precisely because he's willing to burn the board. Gus waits for clean solutions. Walt manufactures dirty ones. When Gus hears Hector might be talking, his protocol is clear. Verify, assess, then eliminate. That's why he walks into the nursing home himself. The system demands confirmation. And that's where the nursing home becomes the perfect trap. On paper, it's safe. Public place, cameras, staff, a frail old man in a wheelchair. Gus's routines tell him this environment is controllable, so he trusts it. But the show has been telling you for seasons that nursing homes, hospitals, family spaces are where Walt hides his ugliest secrets. Gus doesn't see that pattern because his own pattern blinds him. He assumes the place that protects civilians will also protect him. His emotional suppression works the same way. It's a superhuman asset when he calmly drinks the poisoned tequila, or when he executes Victor without raising his voice. But that calm makes him underestimate irrational actors. He reads Jesse as a tool to be stabilized, not as a volatile character whose grief can be weaponized. For instance, he thinks threatening Andrea will control Jesse. Instead, it hands Walt the exact emotional fuse he needs. Then, there's long-term planning. Gus is so focused on the endgame dismantling the cartel, owning the Southwest, that his peripheral vision narrows. He files Hector under broken asset and never updates the entry. The man who obsesses over information forgets to reinterrogate his oldest assumptions. That's a manipulative blind spot the audience can see, but Gus can't. And this is the thematic message the writers keep returning to. In this universe, every superpower has a shadow. Walt's improvisation contains the seeds of chaos that destroy his family. Gus's engineering contains the rigidity that gets him killed. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is realizing that we're drawn to Gus precisely because his paradox feels real. We admire the control, we fear the cost, and we can't look away as the thing that made him untouchable becomes the one weakness Walt can finally touch. So once you understand that, you can start asking a darker question. What happens when someone takes Gus's lessons, strips out the restraint, and applies them with Walt's ego? And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because if I asked you to pick who you'd rather run a criminal empire under, Walt or Gus, a lot of you would quietly choose the guy who slits throats with a box cutter. That's the moral dissonance the show leans into. You know Gus is a mass-murdering drug lord, but you still catch yourself respecting him. If I had to sum up why, it comes down to one word: competence. In a world where everything feels chaotic, where every scene is another explosion of ego and impulse, Gus represents control. He designs systems, routines, redundancies. He builds Los Pollos Hermanos, the industrial laundry, the charity foundation, not just as covers, but as a web of logistics and public goodwill. You're not just watching a villain, you're watching an engineer of reality. So let's examine why that feels reassuring even when it absolutely shouldn't. The first is how the writers manage your sympathy through information. Right from the beginning, the writers establish that most of Gus's violence is aimed at other criminals, cartel bosses, disloyal dealers, volatile liabilities like Victor. When he kills Victor in the box cutter scene, it plays as horrifying, but also as a brutal enforcement of procedure. He isn't raging. He's making a point about protocol. Inside this universe, it looks like a dark form of justice. That framing matters. You rarely see Gus's product destroying families up close. You see him punishing those who disrupt his order. Compared to Tuco's chaos or the cartel's sadism, his operation looks professional. And professionalism is seductive. He doesn't lie with wild stories. He lies with silence, with secrets, with carefully withheld information. He never raises his voice. He never improvises a tantrum. When he poisons the cartel with the tequila, he's willing to drink it himself because he's already planned the antidote. Who wouldn't, on some level, admire that level of foresight? Then you stack that against Walt. Walt is petty, reactive, desperate to be seen. Gus is the grown-up in the room. Where Walt weaponizes emotions and throws manipulative tantrums, Gus suppresses his entirely, burying his motivation for revenge under decades of patience. One man is driven by ego, the other is driven by systems. Which one feels safer to live under, even if both are monsters? And that's the disturbing part. Our fascination with Gus says as much about us as it does about the character. We crave predictability. We want the person in charge to have a plan, even if the plan is evil. In a strange way, rooting for Gus is the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. We let the fantasy of perfect control blind us to the cost of giving that control to someone like him. Because once you're hooked on that fantasy, you're ready for the final question. What happens when that same hunger for control survives Gus and gets inherited by people far less disciplined? That hunger for control doesn't just survive Gus. It mutates. Because if I asked you to put Gus Fring and Walter White on a spectrum of power, you're not comparing good and evil. You're comparing two different blueprints for how control itself can operate. If I had to sum up Gus in one phrase, it would be the architect. Walt, the arsonist. Gus is a planner, a systems builder, the man who designs the room and the exits. Walt is the improviser, the chaos agent who walks into that room, lights a match, and somehow convinces you it was always burning. So let's examine how those two designs clash, and why the writers make you feel the pull of both. Gus builds institutions. Los Pollos Hermanos, the industrial laundry, the charity foundation. Each front is a logistics hub, a PR shield, and an information filter. He recruits professionals like Mike and Tyrus, enforces procedure, and punishes deviation. The box cutter scene isn't a random outburst, it's a boardroom memo written in blood. Follow protocol, or you are a liability. With Gus, control flows through checklists, routines, and redundancies. You don't need to love him. You just need to do your job. Walt leads in the exact opposite way. He doesn't recruit professionals, he recruits vulnerabilities. Jesse's need for approval, Skylar's fear for her family, Saul's greed, Hank's pride, these are his HR department. His power is intensely personal and intensely manipulative. He lies, gaslights, withholds information, then turns around and offers emotionally satisfying stories to close the narrative loop. He doesn't have procedures. He has pressure points. Look at their timelines. Gus spends decades under the cartel's thumb, quietly building one perfect move. Independent supply, a super lab, law enforcement goodwill, and finally, the cartel poisoning. It's a long, cold revenge that takes years of emotional self-control. Walt compresses his entire empire into a few explosive years. One RV, one Tuco, one plane crash, one super lab, one nursing home. Every season is another desperate improvisation that somehow escalates his status and his body count at the same time. On paper, the sustainable model is obvious. Gus's world runs like a corporation, replaceable parts, compartmentalized secrets, minimal emotional noise. In theory, his system could outlive him. Walt's model is a bonfire. It burns bright, fast, and leaves nothing but scorched earth. But here's the pattern interrupt. Whose story are you more glued to? The stable empire, or the man who keeps almost dying and yet keeps winning? Although Gus looks safer, both versions are a kind of hell. So if you had to work for one of them, whose hell would you choose? The cold precision of a boss who will calmly slit a throat to preserve procedure, or the chaotic genius who will drag you into lies you don't even understand until it's too late? Hold that thought, because the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is seeing what happens when Walt tries to steal Gus's blueprint and breaks reality in the process. And here's where this stops being about blue meth and starts being about you. Because if I asked you to strip all the blood and cartel drama away, Gus's genius isn't mystical at all. It's 4 boring words: redundancy, information, relationships, regulation. That's it. That's the room he builds. So let's examine redundancy first. Gus never trusts a single point of failure. He has Los Pollos, the laundry superlab, the charity foundation, parallel supply lines with the cartel and his own operation. If one wall cracks, the ceiling doesn't cave in. In a normal life, that's you having more than one income stream, more than one mentor, more than one plan for a project at work. Do you have a backup if your star employee quits? Or are you running a Walter White operation that collapses the second one person disappears? Information is next. Gus survives because he's always gathering, never oversharing. He studies Hank, studies the cartel, studies Walt, and almost never reveals what he actually knows. That's not just criminal paranoia, that's basic strategic awareness. In a non-criminal context, this is you tracking what your boss cares about, what your team is afraid to say out loud, what the market is quietly signaling before it hits the news. The manipulative version is weaponizing secrets. The healthy version is refusing to be the last one in the room to notice the fire alarm. Then you have relationship building. Right from the beginning, the writers established Gus as the anti-Walt here. He donates to the DIA, shakes hands with law enforcement, sponsors community events, trains a low-ego crew like Mike and Tyrus who follow procedure instead of impulse. In your world, that's professional goodwill, answering emails before you need a favor, helping colleagues on low-glamour tasks, building a reputation that makes it politically expensive to throw you under the bus. It's not about being nice. It's about making yourself structurally hard to attack. Finally, emotional regulation. Gus doesn't win scenes because he's louder. He wins because he's later. Anger hits him, but it passes through a filter before it hits the room. For instance, the box cutter scene isn't a tantrum, it's a demonstration. The cartel poisoning isn't passion, it's premeditation. In everyday life, This is you not firing off the rage email, not making the career-changing decision in the middle of humiliation. If I had to sum up his advantage, it's delayed reaction as a form of control. But there's a dark side. When control stops being a tool and becomes an identity, you start needing bigger crises just to prove you're still the one in charge. Gus personally visiting Hector in the nursing home is exactly that. He has people for this, systems for this, but he needs to look his enemy in the eye. The same structure that kept him alive pulls him into the blast radius. So where are you improvising like Walt, relying on last-minute brilliance, emotional outbursts, and heroics, and where are you quietly engineering like Gus, building processes that work even on your worst day? The point isn't to emulate a drug lord, it's to see how much of your fate is actually just architecture. Because the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is watching what happens when someone like Walt steals just enough structure to be dangerous, without any of the discipline that made it work. And that's where the real magic trick starts. Once you've built the architecture, how do you make stillness itself terrifying? How do you turn a polite, soft-spoken manager into someone who feels more dangerous than screaming cartel bosses with gold grills and rocket launchers? That was the writer's challenge with Gus Fring, and if I had to sum up their solution in one word, it would be control. Right from the beginning, the writers established Gus as visually and behaviorally the opposite of the chaos we'd seen. Tuco rants, the cousins stalk, Hector spits. Gus wipes down tables. He refills napkin dispensers. He thanks customers. So let's examine how, through performance and pacing, that banal routine becomes a threat. The first is casting. Giancarlo Esposito plays Gus like a man whose every cell has signed an ENDA. No wasted movement, no nervous tics, just precise diction and minimal gestures that drip with suppressed information. Watch the eye hide in plain sight, just like you've seen with Walt in the restaurant. Gus's hands stay flat. His posture barely shifts. He blinks slower than anyone else in the frame. The camera holds on his face a fraction longer than feels comfortable. You're waiting for an outburst that never comes, which paradoxically feels worse. The lie isn't in what he says, it's in what he refuses to show. That stillness becomes his most manipulative tool, because the audience keeps projecting violence into the blank spaces. Directors lean into this. Long, quiet walks down bright Los Pollos Hermanos aisles before we cut to the dark, humming lab. Sunny yellow walls, stainless steel fryers, kids eating lunch, then fluorescent emptiness, cameras, gas masks. For instance, in the box cutter episode, we linger on Gus silently changing clothes more than on the actual murder. The bright overhead lights, the plastic booties, the methodical undressing and redressing turn the scene into a ritual of control, not a burst of rage. That's not an accident. It's design. The writers and directors keep giving you quiet scenes before bursts of violence, training you to fear silence. A close-up of Gus's neutral face becomes a countdown timer. You don't know what's going to happen, only that he already decided 3 scenes ago. And then, there's delayed payoff. For seasons, Gus's motivation is a secret. You see his charity foundation, his meticulous systems, his obsession with Salamanca, but you don't know why. When we finally flash back to Max's death at the pool, it retroactively rewires every earlier scene. The friendly manager wasn't just efficient, he was on a 20-year revenge plan. Suddenly his restraint at the cartel meeting, his willingness to drink the poisoned tequila, his insistence on personally confirming Hector's condition all click into place as the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. If I asked you to separate Gus the mastermind from Gus the narrative construction, could you? The feeling that he's always one step ahead is as much editing, framing, and performance as in-universe intelligence. The writers show you his plans when they work and hide his blind spots until Walt exploits them. In the next section, you'll see what happens when that carefully curated aura finally meets a man whose chaos the system can't quite predict. And this is where that aura becomes a weapon. Every time you see Gus standing there with that calm smile, you're not just watching a man in control. You're watching a man who's already playing through 3 different endings to the scene in his head. Right from the beginning, the writers established this with his first real meeting with Walt in the restaurant. On the surface, it's polite small talk, a cautious businessman entertaining a risky proposal. Underneath, he's already run background checks, spoken to Mike, learned Walt's cancer information, and mapped out how this new cook would plug into his existing distribution. When he walks away, it feels like a rejection. In reality, that silence is a contingency test. Will Walt accept no or escalate? Gus is measuring volatility, not chemistry. The same thing happens when he steps into DIA headquarters and shakes Hank's hand. If I asked you to describe that moment, you'd probably say ballsy or fearless. But if I had to sum up what's really happening, it's redundancy. Gus has already built a public persona so clean: charity foundation, community donations, Los Pollos Hermanos as a family brand, that this scene isn't a risk. It's insurance. If Hank ever connects him to the cartel, Gus can point back to this visit as proof of his supposed cooperation. The lie is preloaded into the narrative. Then you get the cartel negotiation in Mexico. Everyone else treats it like a single high-stakes meeting. Gus treats it like a branching flowchart. If Don Eladio accepts his terms, great. He keeps his superlab and his autonomy. If not, there's the poisoned tequila. And even inside that plan, there are sub-contingencies. Micah's extraction, the pre-arranged medical care, the rehearsed route to the safe house. When he calmly sips the drink he knows is poisoned, that smile is literally hiding a clock he's already started. So let's examine what this does to you as an audience member. By the time we reach the middle of his war with Walt, you're conditioned. When Gus is quiet, you assume something is in motion off-screen. When he leaves a room without raising his voice, you don't wonder if he has a plan. You wonder how many. The tension isn't is he in danger. It's which contingency is he about to activate, and who's already dead without realizing it. This is a very specific, very manipulative kind of suspense. The character doesn't need to shout, threaten, or monologue his motivation. He just withholds information, and the writers let the blank space do the talking. In real-world power dynamics, that's exactly how the most dangerous players operate. CEOs, crime bosses, political operators, the ones who never show you their process, are the ones who can replace you before you even know you're on a list. The first is always information asymmetry. Gus knows more than you, earlier than you. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is emotional asymmetry. He feels less than you, or at least shows less. That's why his control looks absolute. But as you're about to see, control built on incomplete information has a fatal flaw. All it takes is one variable you didn't model. And Walter White is about to become that variable. And Walter White is about to become that variable. But pause for a second, because there's a deeper question hiding under all this blue meth and bloodshed. Is being one step ahead even real? Or is it just how the audience describes someone whose plans haven't failed yet? If I asked you to picture Gus Fring, you probably see the calm businessman, the clinical killer, the mastermind who always knows more than everyone else. That image feels true. It's also a little bit of a lie. If I had to sum up the problem with the always ahead myth in one word, it would be blindness. Not stupidity, not lack of intelligence, but selective blindness. No character in Breaking Bad is omniscient. At best, they're ahead in certain domains and completely exposed in others. Gus dominates logistics, surveillance, procedure, information control. But human volatility? That's where his model starts to crack. So let's examine the blind spots the writers quietly build around him. The first is Walter's desperation. Gus reads Walt as an asset with a price tag, family man, scared, financially trapped, ultimately replaceable. He doesn't fully grasp that Walt's motivation isn't money anymore. It's ego and legacy. That's why the "I'll just swap in Gale" plan backfires. In the box cutter scene, Gus thinks he's reasserting control through terror. What he's actually doing is confirming to Walt that this is a death sentence on delay. A man who believes he's already dead is not a variable you can neatly control. Then there's Jesse. Gus is so disciplined that he underestimates trauma as data. He thinks structure, respect, and a steady paycheck will overwrite Jesse's grief and guilt. For instance, he invites Jesse to that quiet dinner, treats him as a professional, tries to peel him away from Walt with validation. On paper, it's a perfect manipulative move. In practice, Jesse's loyalty is chaos. His need for approval from Walt, his self-hatred, his history with kids and violence, none of that fits cleanly into Gus's risk calculations. And finally, Hector Salamanca. Gus believes time and humiliation have neutralized Hector's rage. Wheelchair, nursing home, No information, no communication, no power. But rage doesn't decay on schedule. Right from the beginning, the writers established Hector as pure, concentrated hatred, and Gus still walks into that room to personally witness his enemy's defeat. His need for emotional closure becomes the unmodeled variable that literally blows him apart. Here's the bigger pattern. Complex systems always produce surprises. When you lock down one area, pressure doesn't vanish, it migrates. Gus builds redundancy in supply lines, layers of secrecy, professional crews who follow procedure. The more airtight his operation gets, the more any remaining unknown Walt's pride, Jesse's trauma, Hector's obsession carries catastrophic potential. So his downfall isn't a failure of intelligence. It's a reminder that in a chaotic world, control has diminishing returns. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation doesn't make you safer, it just makes the eventual collapse more dramatic. Quick pattern interrupt. Where are you doing a Gus Fring impression in your own life? At work? In relationships? With your future plans, where do you feel ahead, as if you've gamed out every outcome? Because that confidence can be its own blind spot. You don't see the coworker's quiet resentment, the partner's unspoken need, the one health scare or economic shock that your model doesn't include. The uncomfortable truth is that no one in this story is really one step ahead. They're just temporarily aligned with a system they don't fully understand. In the next section, we'll see how Walt weaponizes that chaos, not by outplanning Gus, but by outbreaking the very rules Gus depends on. So if I asked you to pinpoint the exact moment Walter White's fall becomes non-negotiable, you might say Hank's garage, the train heist, or the phone call to Skylar. But structurally, the real starting gun goes off in a retirement home, when half a man walks out of a blown-out room and then collapses. The instant Gus Fring dies, the last functioning constraint on Walt's ambition disappears. Right from the beginning, the writers established Gus as more than an antagonist. He's a behavioral cage. As long as Gus is alive, Walt is forced into a reactive posture. He has to hide, to negotiate, to obey cook schedules, to accept that someone else controls the terms, the information, and the money. Every time Walt pushes, Gus pushes back with systems, security protocols, dead drops, Mike's surveillance, strict separation between business and family. Walt can fantasize about empire, but he's stuck playing employee. The first is simple. Gus insists on discipline. For instance, when Victor shows off by cooking, Gus doesn't just punish him, he executes him with the box cutter, wordlessly reasserting that procedure outranks ego. That scene terrifies Walt, but it also protects him. A leader that rigid can be predicted, modeled, even manipulated. Walt knows the rules he's breaking. Once Walt kills Gus, that entire architecture of restraint is gone, and the only person left to regulate Walter White is Walter White. And that's the core problem. By removing Gus, Walt doesn't just eliminate a rival, he deletes the one character who treats crime like engineering instead of fantasy. Gus runs 3 fronts, keeps redundancy, invests in community optics, and never lets personal rage leak into the room. Walt steps into that power vacuum and immediately tries to cosplay Gus 2.0 without the emotional firewall. He buys the car wash as a front, talks about the business, rehearses speeches about legacy. On paper, it looks like an upgrade. In practice, it's a deeply unstable imitation. If I had to sum up the irony, it's this. Walt beats the architect, then tries to live in the house he just demolished. All the load-bearing walls Gus spent years building Mike's professionalism, compartmentalized crews, quiet relationships with law enforcement, are gone. What's left is one man's ego holding up the ceiling. How long do you really think that structure can stand once pressure starts to build? So let's examine the emotional difference. Gus drinks poisoned tequila and calmly walks out to vomit in private, weaponizing his own pain as part of a plan. Walt, by contrast, screams at Skylar in the car wash, taunts Hank in the garage, and can't resist telling Jesse, "I am the one who knocks." The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation isn't more control, it's less. The more Walt adopts Gus's methods, the more his lack of self-control corrupts them. Gus's death isn't just his ending, it's the point where Walt's manipulative talents lose their last external limit. From here on, every lie, every secret, every power play is aimed at expanding a kingdom with no structural support. In the next section, we'll see how that collapsing empire forces Walt into louder, riskier moves that stop looking like strategy and start looking like self-destruction in real time. So once Walt's empire starts collapsing under the weight of its own lies, you can do something really fun and really uncomfortable: rewind the entire show and watch it as if Gus Fring has been there the whole time, quietly taking notes. If I asked you to rewatch season 1 through Gus's eyes, what changes first? Not the explosions, the information. Right from the beginning, the writers establish that Walt thinks he's discovering the drug world. But through a Gus lens, he's not discovering anything. He's accidentally flagging himself on Gus's radar. Go back to Crazy Handful of Nothing. That blue meth? In Gus's system, a product that pure doesn't stay a secret. Some middleman, some runner, some terrified low-level character is reporting up the chain. You're not watching Walt make a bold move, you're watching Gus receive a data point. So let's examine Mandala and app with that in mind. When Saul brings up a very quiet, very careful distributor, the scene plays as a lifeline for Walt. From Gus's side, it's a controlled experiment. He sends an emissary, tests Jesse's reliability, measures Walt's desperation. That polite meet in Los Pollos, Hermanos? Every pause, every glance at the security cameras, every second Gus keeps Walt waiting is about control. You're meant to read Walt's hunger. On rewatch, try reading Gus's caution instead. The first is 1 minute. Most people focus on the cousins hunting Hank. Watch Gus. That calm visit to the hospital, the concern for the family, the offer of support to law enforcement. This is not kindness, it's battlefield positioning. He's insulating his public persona while quietly steering cartel assets. A half smile to Hank becomes a strategic signal. I'm close enough to comfort you, but far enough that you'll never suspect me. Then, hit box cutter. For instance, the original shock is Victor's murder. Through Walt's eyes, it's terror. Through Gus's, it's a systems correction. Victor broke protocol, got seen at Gail's apartment, became a liability in a world where anonymity is the only real armor. Gus doesn't explain, he demonstrates. That silence is a manipulative tool. He lets Walt and Jesse invent their own terrifying motivations for him, which is far more effective than a speech. If I had to sum up what this rewatch does, it turns Breaking Bad from the story of one man's rise into a clash between two philosophies of power: Walt's improvisational, ego-driven chaos versus Gus's engineered procedural order. One lies loudly, one lies by omission. One hoards leverage, the other designs the entire board. And once you're seeing that board, you start noticing who else is reading it. Mike isn't just Gus's enforcer. He's the practical ethicist of this world, constantly calculating risk and blowback. Saul isn't just comic relief. He's a survivalist who understands narrative control better than either of them. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is realizing that when these perspectives collide, Gus might not be the only one who was always one step ahead. So if I asked you to trace Gus Fring's journey in one straight line, you'd almost miss how extreme that transformation really is. You go from a traumatized outsider on that pool deck in Mexico to the patient builder of Los Pollos Hermanos, to a community hero shaking hands with cops and school principals, to a cartel slayer poisoning an entire bloodline, and finally, to a victim of one unpredictable gambit in a dusty nursing home. If I had to sum up Gus in one sentence, it's this: he stays one step ahead by refusing to live in a world he doesn't control. While other characters chase power through brute force or raw emotion, Gus designs systems social, logistical, emotional that squeeze randomness out of the equation. For instance, Los Pollos isn't just a chicken restaurant. It's a brand, a charity sponsor, a PR shield that makes him politically radioactive to investigate. The industrial laundry isn't just a meth lab. It's an underground factory built to make human error statistically irrelevant. Right from the beginning, the writers establish that Gus's real weapon isn't intimidation. It's infrastructure. He operates on 3 fronts at once, each one feeding the others with information, money, and legitimacy. He personally vets people like Mike and Tyrus, choosing low-ego professionals over hotheads, because procedure is safer than passion. Even his emotional life is put on lockdown. The trauma of Max's death becomes fuel for a 20-year revenge plan, not a breakdown. Every secret is cataloged. Every relationship is instrumental. Every scene with him feels like he already played it out in his head. But that level of control has a cost, and the show never lets you forget it. Decades of suppressed emotion turn Gus into a man who can stand inches from Hector Salamanca, promise annihilation, and mean it without raising his voice. Constant vigilance means he can't truly love, can't truly relax, can't ever be fully honest with anyone. His family is a supply chain. His closest intimacy is with routine. It's effective, it's terrifying, and it's deeply tragic. So let's examine his death not as a failure of planning, but as the one scenario his system could never fully neutralize: genuine chaos. Walter White weaponizes the one variable Gus can't spreadsheet into submission: the suicidal spite of Hector Salamanca. Gus's paranoia even contributes to it. He insists on personally confirming Hector's condition, walking straight into the trap. Order walks into chaos, and the show's core theme detonates right along with him. In the end, that final half stride out of Hector's room gives you the perfect last image. Half of Gus is still the immaculate chess master, tie straight, mask intact. The other half is gone. This is the man who mastered logistics, perception, and fear, who outplanned a cartel and built an empire from a fast food counter. But he never mastered the one thing he needed most: the ability to let go. And that's why the next character we have to talk about doesn't beat Gus by being smarter, but by being willing to burn the entire board. So here's where this stops being a distant character study and turns into a mirror. If I asked you to pick a life, not just a favorite character, whose world would you actually step into? Gus's cold precision or Walt's volatile genius? Because that's the real tension the writers are playing with. On one side, you have Gus, routines, systems, redundancy, los pollos hermanos up front, industrial laundry in the back, charity foundation on the brochure, everything labeled, everything scheduled, everything under control. On the other side, you have Walt, chaos, improvisation, last-minute brilliance that either saves everyone or blows the entire scene to pieces. So let's examine what you're really choosing. Under Gus, your life is stable. You show up on time, follow procedure, keep your head down. The trucks run on schedule, the money appears when it's supposed to, and as long as you don't break protocol, you are relatively safe. It's corporate evil. Performance reviews with a body count. Under Walt, there is freedom, but it's the kind of freedom that comes with a coin flip every day. Are we rich or are we dead? If I had to sum up the trade-off in one word, it's tolerance. How much risk can you tolerate? And what kind of control can you live under? With Gus, the danger is distant but absolute. The box cutter scene tells you everything. One violation, one visible mistake, and you're gone, surgically removed to protect the system. With Walt, the danger is constant but personal. He promises partnership, then lies, gaslights, and rewrites the rules whenever his ego or fear demands it. Ask yourself, do you want predictability or excitement? Gus offers predictability with zero autonomy. You will never be asked for your opinion on strategy. You are a replaceable piece in an immaculate machine. Walt offers excitement with the illusion of autonomy. He talks like you're part of the plan, but the plan is always serving his motivation first, and you only find out the truth when it's too late to say no. There isn't a right answer here, and that's the point. The writers aren't asking you which man is less evil. They're asking which kind of danger you understand. Some of you in the audience are going to say, "Give me Gus. I can live with rules. I can't live with constant lies." Others will say, "At least with Walt I can push back. Chaos is better than a noose disguised as a uniform." So tell me in the comments, whose operation would you rather work under, and why? Be specific. Talk about your own tolerance for control, for risk, for secrets and information asymmetry. I'll be reading, and the most insightful takes on Gus's precision versus Walt's chaos will probably end up featured in a future video. Because the way you answer this question says as much about you as it does about them. And that brings us to you planning what comes next. If I asked you to pick the next mind we should dissect, who jumps out first? Is it Saul Goodman with his carnival of loopholes and legal half-truths? Mike Ehrmantraut with his quiet systems and brutal competence? Hector Salamanca with his volcanic rage trapped in a failing body? Or someone from Better Call Saul whose motivation still feels like a secret the writers are daring you to decode? If I had to sum up what we're doing on this channel in one word, it's control. Not just who has it in a scene, but how they build it, lose it, weaponize it. With Gus, we framed it as superpower and shadow. His superpower is long-term planning and information control. His shadow is rigidity and emotional repression. So let's examine the rest of this universe the same way. When you think about Saul, what's his superpower? Verbal misdirection? Turning every lie into a joke until the audience, the court, and even the cops relax their guard? And what's his shadow cowardice? Self-sabotage. The way he can't stop running the bit even when the bit is killing him. With Mike, the first is obvious. Discipline. Procedure. The man is a walking checklist. But his shadow might be that he believes he can control chaos if he just thinks 3 moves ahead, when this world keeps proving that 5 moves isn't enough. Hector? His superpower is raw intimidation and a reputation that does half the work for him. His shadow is that he can't see past his own rage long enough to design the room the way Gus does. In the comments, tell me who you want a full psychological and strategic breakdown on next, and be specific in those terms. What's their superpower? And what's their shadow? Don't just write Saul is funny or Mike is cool. Give me the manipulative tools, the information games, the lies they tell themselves and everyone else. For instance, if you think Saul's real power is that he can make crime feel like customer service, say that. Here's the pattern interrupt. This isn't a poll where every vote is equal. The more comments a character gets, the higher they move up the breakdown list. If you want a Mike video next, you can't just think it, you have to write it. If you want Hector, you and every Salamanca fan need to flood the thread. If you want more deep dives in this style, scene-by-scene psychology, narrative strategy, and the manipulative architecture the writers hide under the drama, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss it when your character finally gets dissected. Because if Gus taught us anything, it's that the person who plans ahead shapes the story. So help plan the next one. Choose your character, define their superpower and their shadow. And I'll see you in the next breakdown.